This is Rebia Kadir, once the richest woman in China, twice nominated for a Nobel Prize. She thinks somebody is trying to kill her. A Washington intersection. Rebia's car is hit twice by a van.
There was a red light, she had to stop. So he came out, hit the car one time.
The car backs up and hits again.
Rebia says it was an assassination attempt, that once again China was terrorizing her into giving up her cause.
Uyghur halkının avazını büşüğüdü boğup etmekçiydi. Dünyaya anlatmayı yokup etmekçiydi.
The campaign against China that Rebia Kadir now conducts on the streets of Washington began 60 years ago in the deserts of western China. In 1949, before annexing Buddhist Tibet, Chinese communists annexed Muslim East Turkestan, Rebia's homeland. Her people, the Uyghur, resisted. To maintain stability in this region, China rules with an iron fist, leading to widespread imprisonments and public executions. But by silencing the Uyghur, China unintentionally created the region's loudest voice of dissent. Now, after fleeing to the United States, Rebia has become China's nightmare. But for telling the world what she has seen, Rebia's children have paid a terrible price. This is what Rebia must ask herself. When are your people more important than your family? Like any national leader, Rebia Kadir's working day starts well before breakfast. This morning, she is meeting with her most trusted advisors, Omar Kanat and husband Sadiq Ruzi.
Nobel tinchlik mukofotiga erishib kelishining Xitoy uchun qanchalik bir xatar bo'lganligini Xitoy buni aytib sezgashgan edi. Mushundaq bir yo'llar bilan buningki Nobel mukofotiga erishib kelishining oldini to'sishdi.
Akıl bersiz, nurgun gaplarınızı berip xalqmen intervyu qilgan vaqt aşağı deymanmasman men.
Bundaq bo'ladi. Hozir bu yerda nima bo'ladi desam?
7 days a week, Rebia makes the short trip to her office in downtown Washington, a block away from the White House. Rebia is president of the Uyghur American Association. Here, she runs her international awareness campaign to expose Chinese mistreatment of Uyghurs. To Uyghur exiles, Rebia's homeland is named East Turkestan, a forbidden term in western China. To the Chinese, this land is called Xinjiang, new territory.
When I tell people, you know, I'm Uyghur, and they ask me where it is, and I say the location, they say, oh, you're Chinese, and I tell them, no, I am not. I'm calling on behalf of Rebia Kadir. We just saw the article on the Wall Street Journal. It says 10 million Turkic Uyghurs who have suffered, and she has been consistently saying it's 20 million.
Aşı benim vatanim Xinjiang, Jungo'nun garibiga joylashgan.
I don't know why we're quoting what Chinese tell us.
Uyg'urning rahbari sufti bo'lishim og'zimda men bunday gapni chiqaradigan maqolani yozmayman men qaram. Unda maqolning chiqindan chiqib rasvo qilib xalqimni sotqin.
She's very passionate, she loves her people and she wants everything done now.
Ha? Sen Amerika'da xonum var, men sana aytib qo'yay. Saat yakunini taqib etaman men sana deb qo'yay ularninki.
So it's like she works 10 hours a day, so you feel like, you know, guilty working only 8 hours a day.
The most successful business person among her people, Rebia is boss in a man's world. A half-hour drive from the office, Rebia's daughter Ray manages a maternity shop. Seizing an opportunity to leave China over 10 years ago, Ray remains in exile in the United States.
Hello? Apa? Bizden bu kasan omdaslığa çıkan məmmanlı etraf değil, məmmanlı bizden oyduğu saxmandı. Bir saatlik nəsi o? Şu günü bizden oy kasanla buldu o. Andaq olsa, bugün keçdi mən sizin ağılı varay. Mağıl qoşan. Tomorrow, she's gonna have a party in the small apartment and 15 people are going, how they're gonna fit it? I said, come to my house, I'm gonna do it tomorrow. And she said, do you have this, do you have that, do you have this, do you have that? And she's talking about all politics, bullshit. I hate it, I'm telling you. I don't wanna hear nothing about it. Lilian, come down. I can't understand what she's trying to do. She's trying to help people back home. But I just want to live like a normal life. You done with your homework? Are you full? Are you editor? Draw by yourself. Ed oturup anam janglet, majangla tasto.
Slava taptın İlya. Slava taptın. Ha? Ne oturup slava? Bana çelin bunu.
I don't have anything against playing. It's just that it gets kind of annoying after a while. People start asking you questions about your personal life. Like my grandma, for instance, they just keep crowding her. I don't like being crowded. Huh? She's cold.
Yurtum Altay, Şarkı Türkistan'ın şimalı tərəfə orlaşqan. Yaz günü deryalarda su üzüp oynayımız, at minip oynayımız. Onundakin tağlardan gul terip, ekirip öylərdə. Oxşaşmağan avazlar bilen sayraydığına ait çiraylıq müzik mənzilləri payda oldu. Hazırkı tərəqqiyyatdı bu güzel qoynağa ağan.
When Communist China took over East Turkestan in 1949, they promised autonomy for the Uyghur, the same pledge made to the Tibetans.
The Chinese communists had inherited this enormous empire left by the Qing dynasty, and they felt that it was necessary to secure that area to prevent foreigners coming in and taking control.
Xitay hükümeti oldu bilen nihayetli biz yardım kılımız dep Uygurlarını teşkillep Xitay'nın, Ruslarının evetken casusları aşı Uygur halkının hemmisini aşı Xitay askerlerini çavakçılık.
Well, at first, the communists came bearing brotherly love and cooperation, solidarity, help the Uyghurs develop.
Öylerge kilip, işlerinin aldılarımızı süpürüp, su ekep atkamasa kollarımızdan çilekli ilip, ağırıp kağa adamlarımızdan davalap, ola yemek perişterek işlerini kıldı.
But of course, the honeymoon didn't last for very long.
2 aydan keyin bir teşviqat qilishga başladı. Sizlarni olvastılarmış Uyghur halkını bəxtsiz qılğan, ularni pul tapqan adamlar, sizlarning qininglarni ishqin. Ularni yo'qitib biz pul tapqan Uyg'urlarni, pul tapqanlarni yo'qitib boylarni, Uyg'urlarni baxtli qilamiz dedi. Her bir yezide 3'ten 5'ten adamni atdı. Xitay bastırıp durdu, etip durdu, tutup durdu, Uyghur halkından çıkıp durdu. Şarkı Türkistan'ın Uygurlarını Xitay besip algandыкilla Uyg'urlar bir yer o'tirishga ruxsat qilmay, tarqaqlashtirish siyosati deb bir siyosat chiqardi. U to'rdan chiqib qolgan kapitalizm. Shu uch qitim harakatda to'rdan chiqib qolgan deb. Shuning bilan biz shu qitimda kichik vaqtimizda halqa shu Aqsu degan yer surgun qilib ketdik. Ularning Uyg'urlarni boshqarish usuli biri kambag'allashtirdi. İkinci ma'rifsizlaştirdi. Üçüncü Xudo o'g'an e'tiqodini oridi. Endi qolgan gapni demisami bo'ldi, Uyg'urlar uyqusini ichishga boshlagan vaqti bular bostirishni allaqachonda tartib qilib bo'ldi.
Chairman Mao's first social experiment, the Great Leap Forward, promised growth. But the communes failed, bringing drought and years of mass starvation. Preoccupied with the famine, China briefly loosened its control over Xinjiang. Angered youth and separatist groups now had more room to organize. As a teenager, Rebia was deeply affected by the bold actions of the Uyghur protesters, who took their grievances to the Chinese.
Şu vaqtda har bir qitim tashkilotlar ko'tarilgan vaqtida men shu esimga kelgandan tortib shularga qatnashib shularga jangchi o'g'im kelib ketadi.
But at the first sign of dissent, the Chinese quickly arrested student organizers. They were sentenced to extended prison terms.
Ularni anglasam ulardan faxrlanib ketatdim. Ular xalqni qutqizishga o'zini otaga odamlar deb meningki qalbimda ular bir qahramon obrazini yaratdi.
As protest organizers were being imprisoned, Rebia was married off at age 14 to a government bank manager with a promising future.
Onunki maaşını aytı tövendi. $7 alattı ayda. Dollarga hesaplaganda $7. Bizning ailemizde iqtisodiy jihatdan yetishmaydi pul. Ballajıq. Shuning uchun men ularga bir kichik bolalarning oyog'ini tikish, ayollarning ichki ko'ngligini tikib setish maxfiy so'zini aytadi.
Rebia's capitalist practices were frowned upon and difficult to keep secret under the communist regime.
Onun uchun men oshkor bo'lib qoldim. Yo'lishim banki boshlig'i partiya a'zosi. Shuning bilan yo'lishimni idorasidan qattiq besim ishlatdi.
Without a job, Rebia lost custody of her 6 children. Ray, her eldest daughter, suddenly found herself in charge of her father's household.
2 youngest brothers coming up, only 2 years and 4 years old, and the other one 6, 4, and I was only 9. So I just felt like I'm the mother.
Meanwhile, Rebia, divorced, uneducated, and a Uyghur, had few options. She rented a small room and began washing people's clothes for money.
Hem de normal qarmıgan bana, tazı yaxşı qarmıgan bu işten ait. Nurgun hata, köz qarashlar, nurgun alqa yülünler bop ketip, men toğırlıq. Lekin keyin men özümün əmeliyyətim bilə olanı yengib çıxdım.
It wasn't until after Mao's death that things eased up. And when that happened, it was seen that this repression of the people of the far west was a mistake, and that they were only alienating people who lived in a politically sensitive area.
With change in the late 1970s came more opportunities for Rebia. Her laundry business grew, enabling her to invest in small properties.
Ticaret qilish jarayonida men o'sha yezi qishloq hamiyalar yo'l tijorat qilish jarayonida, lekin men o'sha tijorat qilish jarayonida Xitoy hukumatining nima uchun Uyg'urlarni iqtisodiy jihatdan shundoq nomrod qoldirganligining tub sababini topib chiqdim. O'zining atisini va o'zining vatanini, o'zining xalqini, o'zining avlodini o'ylashga uning vaqti qolmaydi ekan.
As a Muslim and a Uyghur, Rebia surprised everyone when her business prospered. Now she was in a position to help her people. But first, she needed a like-minded partner.
Davamlıq romanlarını okuğa vaxtında aşındaq bir qəhrəman bilən şununki yandışıb bu xalqqa yardım qısam dep özümni xuddi elə romantik fantaziyadək oylaydım. Mən menin izləydiğim adamım ana özünün vətəniga aşındaq bədəl töləb, puldummu, həmmə nərsədən vaz keçib özünün xalqını suyalagan adam idi.
Her friend suggested a man, Sadiq Ruzi, just freed from prison after 9 years for organizing student protests. Upon release, the Chinese had banished Sadiq to a remote mountain village. Rebia was undeterred.
Ben ayrıklarım bilen Kaşgar'a düştüm. Kaşgar'ın maşini bilen yanı bir yer vardım. Üyedim piyade neç kilometre yetmeyi unutmam. Onun çıraylıklığını bilmeyemem, sertlikini bilmeyemem. Fakat onun halkının söygenlikini ben bilemem. Çünkü benim kiyim farkım, Turkum ve ulanın kiyim farkı, ulan namurat, kiyimleri şundak deyken ben başkaça emas. Şunun için ben bağa vaxtında təlimə qarsam o sətmə əməskən şundaq çıraylık, senin hazırki vaxtındakı şundaq yaxşı, güzel bir jigit bana. Endi o kekeşlep bu nemi dep kaldı bu. Nem üçün bir yerge qanda hoppu ki siz kim bulsun men nemiş izleysiniz dedi.
Yani güzel bir ayal da hem de öyle aytqanda. Güzel olmasın hazır güzel deymen degene güzel dedi. Bağan dedi.
Ben seni kutkuzumen dedim. Sen beni kutkuzusan dedim. İkimiz halkı yardım kılımız dedim. Şunun için ben sen bilen toy kılmayan dedim. Sen karardan deyim. Ben o vakti yaman çıraylıktım karardım. O çaşlarımın nahayet uzun çaşlarım vardı deyim. O kanda beni yakış görmek kralaydı o deyim.
Uygur demeydi adam bulan onu. Ben bize menselmedim. Gap sözde qarab men enselmedim. Xitayni şpion diye ondan eskenmedi. Rabia meni şuna oylaydı dep qanda oylamadım da. Ben de oylamadım. Çünkü endi bir xalq arasındaki ayal. Bu yoki yuqoridan kelayotgan ya hukumat ishlaydigan ayal emas da. Xalqning ishlaydigan ayal. Men herkes unda oylamadim. Atrofdagilarni oylagan.
Ben ketimen, çokum sen beni izleysen. O şunda kıldı. Benim közüm, sözüm, çeçim, şu vaxtıda tuğa hareketim, vücudum, bütün hem nersemni yatlıvağam. Yürek bağrımını telip ketti kan kıgan bir ok, yalğız uçkan turnadır ben konarcayım yok degen iki mısra. Ne şeyler? Lekin keyin bize toy kıldık.
Shunda savol qo'yganki, Rabia Qadirda siyosiy maqsad bo'lmasa, turmadan chiqqan bir odamni, hech kim yaqin kelmaydigan, xizmat tegmaydigan, rahmat o'zi salom qilmaydigan bir odamni izlab yashab borgandan biri buni jur'atiga opirinda, ikkinchisi uni siyosiy maqsaddan nima ekanligini tushunsam bo'ldi.
By the 1990s, the old Chinese order was breaking up. China's leader, Deng Xiaoping, famously proclaimed, "To get rich is glorious." As China opened to the world economy, a new generation of Chinese created an unprecedented demand for consumer goods. Foreign investment and technology poured into China. Now, major deposits of oil, coal, and natural gas could be extracted from the vast deserts of Xinjiang province. A 4,000-kilometer pipeline, a modern industrial marvel, was laid from Xinjiang to Shanghai to sustain the growth of over 100 million people for the next 30 years. The resource-rich province of Xinjiang had opened the door for China to become a competitive world power. Uyghurs expected benefits to be produced from the bounty of their own lands. But the Uyghur were overlooked in favor of Han Chinese migrant workers from the east who came in daily by the thousands. Cities appeared to grow from the desert overnight.
Xinjiang represented
the beachhead to the west. All of a sudden you had a completely different set of incentives for Chinese to come into Xinjiang. Now it wasn't being forced to go there in order to do something for the good of the country. Now it was an opportunity for them to do something good for themselves and make money.
Despite Xinjiang's economic boom, the Uyghur were left to work in tourism and other menial jobs.
Ular iqtidarsızlığından emas, siyasetin korkunundan, siyasetin besimidilla aşdaq toğun ayallarken.
Realizing the struggle of Uyghur women was parallel to her own previous experience, Rebia founded the Thousand Mothers movement.
Ana kurga vaxtımda, aşı kurga vaxtımda mı aş ayallarını aşında yetildirip çıkmak istedim. Ben dedim, özünü qutqaz dedim, aileni qutqaz dedim. Ani sen şu vaxtda qahraman bolsan. Seni hiç kim kep qutuldurmaydı, özündən qutuldur.
As China opened its borders to trade in the 80s and 90s, Rebia's investments turned into bustling marketplaces, restaurants, and hotels. By 1994, Rebia had become China's wealthiest entrepreneur. Word of her success and charity work made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It caught the attention of Bill Gates, who flew to Xinjiang province to meet Rebia. Rebia had become her people's role model.
Ben başkalarının közüge qutqazgıcı ve Ali janap körüngenden keyin başkalarga bolgan qarzım her günü həsilep eşipmangdı.
But Rebia's best efforts to stem unemployment among Uyghurs couldn't compete with a growing army of Chinese entrepreneurs. It didn't take much to trigger Uyghur outrage. In 1995, Uyghurs rioted in the town of Hotan over Chinese interference of their Muslim practices. The Chinese needed a respected Uyghur voice to stabilize this increasingly volatile region. Rebia Kadir, by now reputed to be the 7th richest businessperson in China, was appointed a special consultant to the People's Congress of Xinjiang. In what appeared to be a sign of good faith, the new Chinese president, Jiang Zemin, asked Rebia to represent her people at the UN Women's Conference, hosted in Beijing.
Ben dünya ayallar sepege kirdim dep oyladım. Dünyadaki ilgar, yetekçi rol oynadığı ayalların sepege kirdim dep oyladım.
Freedom to participate in the political process. I know many were kept from attending this forum.
Demokratie und Freiheit ein.
While Rebia listened for the first time to voices free to challenge their own governments, President Zemin did his best to keep Rebia secluded and quiet.
Jığında ayallarının ayetleri, Uyghur ayallarının hukuk meselesi doğruluk sözü dedim. Şu menin aqımdan adamlar nazarat qilishdi. Cumhur hükümeti meni terbiyelep, meningden başka özlerinin gumaşçıları oxşaş paylanışını oyladı. Şu maqsad bilan abardı.
Directly after Rebia's controversial speech, her husband Siddiq took a risk by publishing articles demanding basic rights for his people. His actions did not go unnoticed.
Şunun bilan Siddiqacını maxfiy qo'lga oldiganlik, o'rlashtirilganligini anladım.
Ya Kadir Bukhar'ın kanda bilip kaldı desem, başlıkla Abdülmuray'ın derecek başlıklarına kotulları var o yüzünki, ayalları var o. O ayallarının kiyim keçekke, rang buyumlar amrak geldiğini bilirsen o.
Ben Siddiqacının çıkıp çetellik çıktısam, Siddiq fakat vatenden çıkılır, ölügün bir şeyde kaldı dedi.
Vatan da ayrılıp çıketmek ters noktaydı insan kadar, ilacı yoktu.
Lekin ben onu aldap ap çıkıp gittim Amerika'ya. Ben soğudu var dedim, şu soğuduğunu kılımızda ap çıkıp lan, pasportunu aplam, siyasi panalık tevfet.
Siddiq moved in with Rebia's daughter Ray, who was already studying in the U.S. Rebia re-entered China without her husband. She was immediately put on a blacklist.
In 1997, the Chinese had started one of their famous anti-crime campaigns. It was called the Strike Hard campaign, which in the rest of China meant picking up small-town criminals, but in the West, it meant attacking the Uyghurs.
In 1997, tens of thousands of Uyghurs in the city of Gulzha protested against Chinese discrimination. This footage, smuggled out of China, shows troops sent in to silence the protests. Uyghur militants retaliated with a series of bombings. Thousands of Uyghurs were caught in the middle. Rebia caught the last plane into Gulzha to witness the devastation before military lockdown.
Geçen ağam boşunda videoga ağam narsa ağam material tizimlik hem narsani aytma istas bütün bedenimni yalamayla tapşırıp aldım. Bunun bütün materyalını qo'limda.
For 2 weeks, the town was shut down. Troops were called in to search all over the region for Uyghurs that took part in the protest. Rebia looked on in disbelief.
Men dastlabki undaqmi ularga qarshi emasdim. Kim cho'qim biz ahvolni eshitsak, haqiqiy ahvolni ko'rsa.
The accused were paraded before a packed football stadium. Their crimes broadcast to the crowd. Across the region, an unknown number of Uyghurs were publicly executed. Rebia was still a special government consultant. She flew to the Chinese People's Congress in Beijing to deliver a condition report on the Uyghur. Rebia explained in detail what she saw in Gulzha, claiming China's violent aggression was destabilizing her region. The delegates were shocked. They had rarely criticized their government in front of the president. Stripped of her government positions, Rebia and her family were placed under heavy surveillance. But this didn't stop Rebia from keeping her husband Sadiq informed by mailing newspaper clippings to the U.S. Back in Xinjiang province, Rebia set in train events that would prove disastrous for her and for her sons and daughters.
11. günü Uygurlarning kişilik hukuk Uygurlarning hazır duch kelyapatgan azap uqubatlardan 10 modda narsani yezib Amerika Kongressiga berdi.
But Rebia never met the U.S. delegation. 5 minutes before reaching their hotel, she was arrested.
Turmuq taşıldı. So'roq qildi. 2 kun sirti so'roq qildi. Undan keyin turmuq aytdi. Davlat maxfiyatligini sirtqa pash qilgan.
Sending newspaper cuttings to America, which have been published in China, seems a non-crime. But the act of sending them is treachery. It's letting down the motherland. It's betraying the unity of the motherland, this thing that Chinese governments have always clung to because it's such a huge place and so difficult to govern. So there's a kind of paranoid element in the sentencing.
In an official response, the Chinese government said, Rebia Kadir was convicted not only of subversion on charges of endangering national security, but also convicted of fraud and tax evasion.
Özünün bilgeni boyunca hüküm çıkardım, hiç kadar günah ötkazmadım. Ben özüm cinayetçi dep oylamayım.
In the U.S., Sadiq listened helplessly as news came in of Rebia's imprisonment.
Rabia türüne kirgende bek azaplanıp kettim. İçim ağırıp ketdi. Endi insanın bu tatkan azabını men sana til ile ifade beremem. Bir dakika bir sekund Rabia diye isim Rabia'nın obrazı beni göz aldırmayı ketmedi bir 8 yıl. Bu da 2 günün 6 yılda durmayadı.
Yok, 20 ay mı? 2 yıl bolup kaldım. Karanғы öy, tarat kıldığan narsalar şu öyünün içinde. Tunğu tarat kıldırıp bir qetim cinayetçiler kötü kaç ketdi. Bazen de bedellerim kıçışıp ketdi. Meni onu köketmedi, işte yenimdeki öyge kirip kıyınıda ularını şunda korkunçluk avazını aldım.
In Washington, Sadiq and Ray worked tirelessly to free Rebia. They tried to exert diplomatic pressure on China by highlighting its notorious human rights record. Suddenly, events on U.S. soil changed the world's perception of Muslims. After September 11th, the U.S. built its entire foreign policy around the idea of a global war on terror.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
China was quick to turn criticism of their human rights abuses to its diplomatic advantage.
Both China and the U.S. are victims of terrorism in the war against terror.
China invited President Bush to Beijing to forge an alliance in the interests of both nations.
President Zhang and the government stand side by side with the American people as we fight this evil force.
After September 11th, the Chinese state started to very publicly suggest that the Uyghurs were involved in violent resistance to the Chinese state in the form of terrorism, and therefore could be linked to an international phenomenon that was not only the enemy of China, but was the enemy of the West, the enemy of the U.S. and Europe.
And nobody could complain about the Chinese without being told, well, this is the war against terrorism. We have it in our borders, inside our borders too.
In 2002, as Rebia entered her 3rd year in jail, international sympathy for imprisoned Muslims had evaporated. Each day in solitary confinement took its toll on Rebia.
45 günde bir qetim açıqdı. 1 minut artıq turub eliş mening uchun aytganda yillardek tuyulatdı. O kurnida o qara putqulamning jini yo'q, aram mengib chiqma bir siqo. Nafas olsam deb o'ylayman. Sen bir qush qaçqanning ustiga ushib ketib bor. Men hozir nimishqa ashnaga aylanib qololmayman dedim. Shuni o'ylag'anim esimda bor. Erkinlik degan bu narsaning nima degan qiymat pul undaq vaqtida sen pulni yaxshi ko'maysan, kiyim kechak, do'st, seni hech bo'lmaganda bir qachning birini urdigan yoki seni tillaydigan, sen bilan urushadigan odamlarni shunchalik sevinasan. Shuning uchun u yerda sana o'lim ancha qo'rqinchli ko'rinmaydi.
Over the next 3 years, Ray and Sadiq fought an uphill battle in Washington to release Rebia. Gradually, they found support from human rights groups and politicians, such as U.S. Congressman and Holocaust survivor Tom Lantos.
Well, I think my colleagues and I felt that we should do everything we can to bring about her freedom. We don't consider Rebia a terrorist.
Ben onun aldığında da kattık işip ketken turumda. Doktor hanım apamı kandı. Keyin Amerika hükümeti Amnesty International Human Rights Watch arlaşkandı ki, yani düğü hafanda işin aşağı arlaşkandı ki, beni doktora apırıp devam etti.
Advocates in the US government worked discreetly with the Chinese for Rebia's release. Finally, China granted Rebia permission to seek medical treatment in the US. But first, like all political prisoners, she had to recant. This footage is believed to be a recording of Rebia's last days in prison.
Ben dedim, ben sizlerge askerlik kılmayayım dep verdim ekan. Milli bölgünçü yaman modisi yaman diye. Özden yaman modisi yaman diye. Man uhtağını da 18 ay davalınıza çıktı. Onu siyasetki ardışıp bizden işki işimizi sırtı etmeysen dedi.
As Rebia prepared to leave China, she knew that this may be the last time she would see her children. In Washington, Sadiq received a covert visit from the US State Department.
Balamni chaqirdi, balamni etkildi o'zi, xabarni yetkazdi. Rabia Qadir aeroplanga chiqmay turib hech kimga aytma, lekin sen iddi tayyorlab qilib qo'y dedi.
The Chinese made her promise that she would never do anything against the government when she came to the United States. But she did everything totally opposite.
Safe in the US with her family, Rebia immediately got to work.
Siz bağlamsınız?
Alışık komünist oldu tepkimiz.
Komünistleri karanlık.
Arkadaşın açıdan komünist arkadaşın açıdan.
Bu ne her günü aşkın mı ya ki ben?
Ya Rabbim de o kim baktı?
Uçuklarımız mantarcımı kırdı babadan ben bunu ülgütlerden aldırtıp gidip basa dedim. Nimisiz değil mi? Kim ki köz alaydı siz? Sizlerin jığınla Türklerin zaman kızmış işganda bize telefon kadınlar bize.
20 to 12, we have to go.
In the hub of US politics, Rebia was well placed to lobby Congress and human rights groups to recognize and raise money for her cause.
Şuna hazır öz takdirini öz belgileş. Çünkü bula aptını mı demedim. Öz takdirini öz belgileş diken demokratiya kişilik hukuk dememiz mustakil deyimiz devatıdır.
Soon she was on international television programs speaking out against China.
Ben rastını, yalganını hemesini her devegen bolsam herkes turnuğa uçuşmaydım. Rastını yalgan dikeldiğim için turnuğa uçtum.
It wasn't long before Rebia's statements in the US were monitored by Chinese authorities. They were angry about Rebia's refusal to adhere to the terms of her release. The Chinese government issued a statement saying, instead of staying in her hospital bed during her parole, Rebia Kadir has broken her promise and been engaged in activities to spread rumors, distort facts, and vituperate the Chinese government.
We know the Chinese government closely monitor our activities, watch and follow us, and they're doing everything in their power to destroy us.
Rast, ola bir kıtım üyümünü resimli tatvatqa yerden Lale, Rahile, bu körüp kılıp bir haber kıldı.
China has a great presence here in all walks of life. They can tap into that presence to monitor just about any situation they want. They have the resources, they have the manpower to keep an eye on those that they view as a threat, no matter what country that they might live in.
In the winter of 2006, Rebia's understanding of her safety in the U.S. was about to be shaken.
Surya was dropping my mom off, so when she came to the red light, there was a red light, she had to stop, she had to make a left turn. But the car was coming out of where she was going into. So he came out, hit the car one time, and Surya said the guy was looking at her like, I'm hitting you.
The car backs up and hits again.
Машина ақымақ ішкі қытым ұрды. Егер нормал болса тегіп кететті бір қытым. Қайты ақы кеніп кеп ұрмайтты машинасы мені.
My mom was kind of pushed back and forth.
The lady, her secretary, she said, oh my God, this is an assassination. And she started screaming, assassination. I mean, I'm hoping that that accident is not a Chinese thing to get her in U.S.
When I got to hospital, there were like 10, 15 people waiting outside.
One of her small, bones in her spine broke. And the doctor basically said if the spine broke, then she would be paralyzed. She would have been paralyzed. But luckily, thank God, just a small bone.
And I thought, if she stops talking, I mean, I thought a lot of things, like what would happen to our cause, what would we do?
We felt it was really an attempt to kill her.
On Capitol Hill, Congressman Tom Lantos invited President Bush and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to a dinner to support the Uyghurs' case. Still recovering from her injuries, Rebia wasn't going to miss this opportunity.
She can never sit in one place without doing anything. She has to be busy. And I cannot imagine how she spent that 6 years in jail. I really can't imagine that.
While many supporters showed, President Bush and others did not.
Here is a woman with the courage of her convictions. She has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, which she so richly deserves.
Rebia's Nobel nomination was her recognition for speaking out in the U.S. Inevitably, China would be provoked by Rebia's growing international regard. June 1st, 2006. Children's Day in China. Rebia's children and grandchildren decided to have a picnic in the countryside of Xinjiang province. Waiting for them were 50 police officers.
Thank you for calling. My mom called and said, well, your brothers got arrested.
15 yaşlık, 12 yaşlık nevrilerimden, çiçillerden sonra bekettim. Anından keyin iki oğlumni aşı 50-60 adam bir chatda urturup aşı oğlumning urgan ovozini anglasında telefonni mening qizim tutqizib qo'yibdi. Apamga al telefonni. Aş ko'krab baqirgan ovozlarni angladim. Apa, ushkunlarimni bak urib ketdi. 50 dan ortiq adam tepib uryapti deb baqirib ketdi. Shundaq bir qiyachiyadan keyin telefonni taqib oldi. Mening oxirgi bolalarim bilan aloqalashgan kunim shu.
Rebia learned that 4 of her children were jailed. Her youngest son, Alim, was sentenced to 7 years for tax evasion, while her son, Ablakim, was sentenced to 9 years for conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism. Without delay, Rebia organized a demonstration outside the Chinese embassy in Washington to bring world attention to her children's arrest. Next stop was Radio Free Asia, which broadcasts unfiltered news by radio and internet into China.
Bu Xitoy hukumatining birinchi uşuqligini, ikkinchi chekidan oshgan nomussizlik bilan qiladigan yolg'onchiligini yuragini parchalab tashlaymiz. Chunki u bir ona, uning 4 farzandini tutsak, u har qancha tosh bo'lsin-mu, har qancha po'lat bo'lsin-mu, uning yuragi har qancha tosh bo'lsin, u bardoshlik bilanmaydi. Xitoy hukumati nihoyatda oddiy o'ylab qapti Robiya Qodirni. Robiya Qodirning bundaq tavlanib chiqishi hargiz Robiya Qodir o'zi emas. 20 million xalqning nolisi bilan Robiya Qodirning go'shlari, qonlari sug'urilgan. Robiya Qodir o'z xalqining taqdiri hal bo'lguncha, erkinlikka erishguncha Muşun to'liq beramiz. Hayır emas, ameliyat shu ishim tuğan. Yetil ketkim bardı. Özel hizmet bardı.
Sana bir savol o'ylab qo'ydi. Dunyoda Xitoydan boshqa qaysi millat, qaysi davlatda jinoyatni onasi bilan dadasi sodir qilsa, uning o'rniga bolasini qo'lga oladigan millat bormi?
Vaqtda 4 bolasini biroq akir ketish degan o'ng'ay to'xtaydigan ish.
You probably know it's not easy for me to bear to think my 4 kids are in jail.
Hazır to'xtab qolsam, hozir chiqarib yetadi. Biroq mening xalqimni qirib yetadi. Mening o baxtli hayotim vaqtida xalqimning ko'z yoshi bilan qinining ustida yashaydi. Mening bolalarımı hargiz mening quvvatqinimdan norozi emas. Bolalarim meni tushunadi. Men bolalarimda faxrlanaman, bolalarim mendan faxrlanadi. Bu azobni o'zimiz, bu yo'lni o'zimiz tanlab oldik.
She's saying that my kids would understand because I'm doing it for my people and they would do the same thing. That's the way we chose it. She chose it. My kids chose it. I don't believe it. I didn't choose it. So. I hope my children and my, grandkids and all the relatives understand me, understand what I'm doing. Our people, they support her 100%, whatever she does. But as for me, I want my brothers and sisters out first before anything happens. I just don't like the fact that now my brother's in jail, how much they have to suffer.
Despite Rebia's call for the release of her children, China answered with stony silence. Rebia's response was to pack her bags and personally take her campaign to the world's media. In Australia, she appeared on newscasts speaking to Uyghur exiles on the steps of Parliament House in Sydney. In Japan, there was enthusiastic coverage of pro-Uyghur demonstrations in Tokyo. In Germany, the media covered her election as president of the World Uyghur Congress, uniting her people under a banner of democracy for her homeland. Finally, at a conference in Prague, President Bush reversed his previous position and chose to support Rebia's cause by openly criticizing China's imprisonment of her children.
Another dissident I will meet here is Rabia Kadir of China, whose sons have been jailed in what we believe is an act of retaliation for her human rights activities.
Endorsement by the White House was a huge personal victory for Rebia. But a year later, With the world's attention on the Beijing Olympics, the empathy Revia had built for the Uyghurs was suddenly threatened. To preempt military activity in Xinjiang, the military again cracked down on the Uyghurs. Some retaliated. But because of Revia's work, China's attempt to portray the Uyghurs as terrorists largely failed. The international media were skeptical. Within 2 years of her release from prison, world opinion on Uyghurs had changed. But today, Rebia's children are still in prison.
Amerika'da Abla Calla bilen bizler şu hareketini başlaganda Rabia'nı kolga aladı dep oylap bakkan emas, kokkan emas. Endi Rabia onundan korksa, men onundan korksam kim kıldı bu işini?
I think I have to give her, I have to forgive her. I have no other way, no choice. I would torture myself. I could never look at her the same. And what can I do? They're in jail. And the only thing I have left here is my mother.
İkinci bu milletten ümit ketmesi gerekirken ümit bilen turunlar. Xitay biz bu köyümüz erkece. Hala hizmet ediyorlar. Bunundan mı artık kalplerini kolga keltiriş için kurashtiramiz. Bugün kılışılmayla. Bunu fakat şimdi eğitimde koymakçıyım da bunundaki haberler. Hatırcan bulunlar kadar bir sıla çıkıp kamanlar. Ben ya.